Welcome to Legacy Narratives, where timeless stories of history, inspiration, and legacy come to life. Sit back, relax, and let the story unfold. The dust was not yet settled on the prairie town of New Salem, Illinois, when the young giant stumbled into his first great failure. It was 1832, and Abraham Lincoln, all sinew and earnest ambition at 23, had just lost his job, his savings, and now, humiliatingly, an election for the state legislature. He stood on the crude wooden platform, the cheers for the victorious candidates ringing in his ears, a man with nothing to his name but a pair of strong hands and a head full of borrowed law books. To the crowd, he was just another backwoods hopeful who had tried and fallen short. They saw the defeat. They could not see the anvil. For the life of Abraham Lincoln was not a path of preordained glory, but a relentless, brutal, and magnificent forging. A story of how the hardest steel is tempered not by fire alone, but by repeated, shattering blows. This was the first of many falls. Lincoln's early life was a syllabus of hardship. Born into a poverty so deep it was visceral in a one-room Kentucky log cabin in 1809, his childhood was a litany of loss and labor. His mother, Nancy Hanks Lincoln, a woman of keen intellect in a world that had no use for it in women, died of milk sickness when he was 9. The image of her body being lowered into the cold Indiana earth, of he and his sister Sarah left with a grieving, distant father, would haunt him. He watched as life was stripped down to its barest essentials: survival, sorrow, and the search for a sliver of light. That light, for young Abe, was found in the few, precious books he could get his hands on. He walked miles to borrow a volume of Weems's Life of Washington or a tattered copy of Aesop's Fables. He read by the flickering firelight after a day of splitting rails, his mind hungry for worlds beyond the dense forests that hemmed him in. Grammar, history, mathematics, he taught himself, scribbling sums on a wooden shovel by the fire when paper was too dear. This relentless self-education was not a hobby. It was an act of defiance. It was his declaration that his circumstances would not define the borders of his mind. His journey from that impoverished boy to a self-taught lawyer in Springfield was a slow, deliberate climb. He failed in business as a shopkeeper, leaving him saddled with a debt so large it took him 17 years to repay, his national debt, he called it, and he paid every cent, earning the nickname Honest Abe not as a slogan, but as a hard-won reputation. As a lawyer, he became known not for theatrical courtroom dramatics, but for a profound, homespun logic, a deep well of empathy, and an honesty that was both rare and disarming. He could distill complex arguments into simple, powerful stories that resonated with juries of ordinary farmers, yet personal tragedy continued to stalk him. His first great love, and Rutledge, died of typhoid fever in 1835. Her death plunged him into a profound melancholy, a hypo as he called it, so deep his friends feared for his sanity. He would wrestle with this angel of depression his entire life, a dark counterweight to his famous humor and wit. He married Mary Todd, a brilliant, complicated woman from a wealthy family, and though their union was filled with love, it was also tempestuous, strained by her own mental instability and the crushing weight of losing 2 of their 4 sons. Eddie died at 3, and the vibrant Willie would later die in the White House at 11. A loss that would fracture Mary and leave Abraham hollowed out with a grief he could share with no one. It was this man, forged in the fires of failure and grief, who was called to the nation's highest office at its darkest hour. The election of 1860 tore the country in two. As president-elect, he watched the fabric of the Union unravel, state by state. By the time he delivered his first inaugural address, the Confederate cannons were already trained on Fort Sumter. He pleaded with his dissatisfied countrymen, "We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies." His words were met with the thunder of artillery. The Civil War had begun. The presidency tested every fiber of his being. He was mocked by the press as a gangly, backwoods baboon, a tyrant, an imbecile. He endured the open contempt of his own cabinet members, who considered themselves his intellectual and social superiors. He suffered under the relentless, grinding pressure of a war that saw unprecedented slaughter at places like Shiloh, Antietam, and Gettysburg. Telegrams bearing casualty reports piled high on his desk, each one a weight on his soul. He would often slip away to visit the wounded in hospitals, his tall, stooped figure moving between the cots, shaking hands, his face etched with the shared pain of every mother's son. His leadership was not one of bombastic certainty, but of humble, steady conviction. He made mistakes. He appointed generals who were hesitant, vain, or incompetent, and he endured their failures until he found the right men: Grant, the unflinching butcher; Sherman, the merciless prophet of total war. Through it all, his moral compass never wavered. The war, for him, had a singular, ultimate purpose: the preservation of the Union. But he knew that the Union could not be truly whole while the original sin of slavery festered within it. The Emancipation Proclamation was not a sudden act of liberation, but the culmination of a lifetime of moral evolution and political calculation. Lincoln had always hated slavery, calling it a monstrous injustice. But he was a pragmatist. He moved cautiously, knowing he had to hold the border states and a largely racist northern public behind him. The proclamation, issued on January 1, 1863, was a military measure, but it transformed the character of the war. It made the conflict a definitive struggle for human freedom. It invited black men to join the Union Army and Navy, and nearly 200,000 did so, bravely fighting for a liberty they had never known. With each step, Lincoln was not just saving a nation, he was refounding it, pushing it closer to living out the true meaning of its creed. This evolution found its purest, most poetic expression on a cold November afternoon in 1863, at the dedication of a cemetery in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Following a 2-hour speech by the famed orator Edward Everett, Lincoln rose and spoke for just over 2 minutes. In 272 words, he redefined the American experiment. He spoke not of the battle's details, but of its meaning. He invoked the Declaration of Independence's promise of equality, framing the war as a test of whether a nation conceived in liberty, and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal, can long endure. He called upon the living to take increased devotion to the unfinished work before them, so that these dead shall not have died in vain. The Gettysburg Address was a promise etched in air, a covenant with the future. It was the voice of the man who had been forged in hardship, speaking not from a place of triumphalism, but from a profound sense of duty to the suffering and the fallen. The war ground on, a brutal, bloody affair. But by 1864, with Grant's hammer blows in Virginia and Sherman's march to the sea, the end was in sight. Lincoln, exhausted and aged beyond his years, was re-elected. In his second inaugural address, delivered as the war entered its final, bloody weeks, he offered no victory lap, no condemnation of the South. Instead, he delivered one of the most profound and Christian statements of national reconciliation ever uttered. With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. It was a vision of peace without vengeance, of healing without hatred. He was planning for that peace, for a reconstruction that would be guided by mercy, not punishment. On April 14, 1865, 5 days after Lee's surrender at Appomattox, Lincoln allowed himself an evening of leisure. He attended a play at Ford's Theatre, Our American Cousin. His mood was light, finally unburdened. As laughter filled the theatre, a fanatical Confederate sympathizer, John Wilkes Booth, crept into the presidential box and fired a single shot. The man who had carried the nation through its darkest valley, who had preached reconciliation, did not live to see the dawn of the peace he had wrought. The story of Abraham Lincoln is not a fairy tale. It is the ultimate testament to human resilience. It is proof that a person is not defined by their failures, but by their response to them. Every loss, his mother, his love, his elections, his children, could have broken him. Instead, each one became a tool in the forge, hammering his empathy wider, his resolve stronger, his character more profound. He emerged not hardened, but humanized, not bitter, but better. Thank you for joining us on this journey through history and inspiration. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay tuned for more timeless stories. We'd love to hear your thoughts. What part of today's story touched you the most? Please leave a comment below. Until next time, keep the legacy alive.